Welcome everybody! The title of this webinar is How to Build an HTML5 JavaScript Single-Page Application. My name is Anand Raja and I'm a Technical Evangelist and Solutions Engineer with Infragistics. This is an introductory or fundamentals course on single-page applications or SPAs. So if you're new to SPAs or even new to web applications, this is definitely the right webinar for you. Tomorrow at the same time we're going to be doing another webinar about how to write a line of business HTML5 JavaScript application. So if you want to dig a little bit deeper, that's definitely the next progression for you. Before we get started, I just wanted to thank each and every one of you for tuning in today. We definitely know that there are other places out there for you to get this type of information, and we're very pleased that you've entrusted us with your hour. So my commitment to you all is that if you follow me at Twitter at AnandRaja777 and ping me with any questions, I'll definitely get back to you. So just like any other folks in the technical industry, my bandwidth is limited at times. It might take me some time to get back to you, but I assure each and every one of you that if you have a question about the subject, I will either answer it or point you to a resource where you can get that information. I'll also be tweeting a great set of resources for you to continue learning. I'm going to include a link to the source code of the sample application that I'm going to be using today, as well as a free interactive online guide of writing SPAs and choosing various different technologies. So please go ahead and follow me and look out for that tweet. Let's go over the agenda. The first thing that we're going to do is cover the presenter's background. I'll just give you a brief background of where I came from technically and a little bit of my personal information as well, so you get a feel for who I am and where I've been technically. We'll then cover why SPAs are getting so much attention. Why are they relevant today? Why are we focusing on SPAs? And why are you hearing about SPAs so much these days? We'll then go into the anatomy of a single page application. We'll actually dissect it, look at the various pieces so you understand it and have a clear vision of what a SPA is and how it works. Once we develop a solid foundational understanding of the single page application, we'll go to the final step and actually see how to build a single page application. And you'll be able to write your first single page application at the end of this webinar. And I can assure each and every one of you, whether you're new to web applications or single page applications, that you will all be able to write your very own official single page application at the end of this webinar. I'd like to give you a brief background about myself before we begin. I was born and raised in Detroit, Michigan. I've been based out of Los Angeles for the past 10 years or so. The building that I work out of is actually pictured in this shot. I'd like to mention a few companies that I was associated with prior to working for Infragistics. I was a lead developer of the electronic data interchange team at Flagstar Bank that was in charge of interfacing. Spent some time at Invensys as a principal engineer and software architect. I was a consulting architect at Costco on the e-commerce team, and I also consulted at Warner Brothers as an enterprise architect. Here are a few technical certifications that I've earned along the way. And enough about me. Now let's start learning about the single page application. So let's get started with why SPAs are getting so much attention these days. To get a good understanding of
why spas are so important, I think it's really important that we take a look at the technical challenges and what our journey was up until this point. We're going to start by talking about the enterprise and application architecture. So we'll start with the client-server architecture and what it meant from a user's perspective. Right? The end user's perspective is always the most important. First of all, the client-server architecture delivered a very rich and responsive user interface, while you had a lot of the processing happening on the server and data residing on the server. You basically had an application that was running in one process on the client side. So it's a very rich, responsive user interface. We then moved into the end-tier architecture. Again, from the customer or the end user perspective, very rich and responsive. The end user didn't know that the tiers were broken down, and instead of just one server, you had multiple tiers. But at the end of the day, you had a very rich user experience, both as far as a rich and responsive UI, and as well as the data processing that happened in the background. You then moved into a world where the HTML and the World Wide Web was really introduced to the world. At the early stages, this wasn't used for enterprise architecture because it was stateless, right? You really couldn't do much from an enterprise perspective as far as building applications. Well, that all changed when you had server-side technologies such as ASP and JSP, right? You then had a mixed mode where you could actually have all the calls made to a server going through some type of end-tier infrastructure, and the HTML would be built up and spit back to the page. While that was great, it just wasn't very responsive. So from the end user's perspective, you didn't have that rich client-server type of application, right? You didn't have that application that was running in one process. You'd have to wait for postbacks. Just think about that first MapQuest application, and you can probably remember it wasn't anything like the Google Maps. So the Google Map was totally different, and what that did is it added AJAX. It added asynchronous calls, so you're no longer blocking the user, you just have a much richer experience. And that brings us to basically one of the first popular single page applications. Even though it wasn't really called a single page application at the time, the Gmail was very rich and responsive, right? When you'd click on any particular email, you wouldn't have to wait for a post back, right? It just worked. So that's basically the history of our technological challenges and how we got to the SPA, and I think it's very important to understand where we came from. So let's take a look at the pieces of a single page application. In my opinion, the key to learning even the most complex technology is simplicity. So if you look at this image right here, not only do you see the single page application, but you see a lot of other technologies or elements, so to speak, that are often used by a single page application, but aren't actually part of a single page application, right? So what we're going to do is clear up all the noise and just concentrate on the basics of a single page application. So we're going to focus on nothing but the essential pieces for a single page application. So to build the most basic application that qualifies as a single page application or a SPA, what do we need? So to do this, what I'm going to do is use WPF as a reference. I think most of you guys are C# or Microsoft developers. So what I want to do is bring up a technology stack that's very similar in nature. So I'm going to quickly review that technology stack so everyone's on the same page, and then we'll look at that technology stack as it compares to the single page application. So let's just break down the basic technology stack of any XAML application. So first you have the presentation layer that's authored in XAML. You have your business logic written in C#.
You have the CLR runtime and XAML binding that's responsible for all the data binding, right? It's what really makes the magic happen. And at the end of the day, a window is produced, and that's what your users interface with. So now that we're all on the same page as far as that very basic technology stack, let's look at that in terms of a single page application. So let's do the comparison. So for a spa, the presentation layer is going to be written in HTML and CSS. The business logic will be in JavaScript. The runtime will actually be provided by the browser. And a page will be rendered, and that's what your end users are going to be interacting with. So let's just take a step back and look at this picture. So what do you see that's missing here? So you can see everything compares one-to-one. You have a window on the WPF side, you have a page on the SPA side. You have XAML, HTML, C#, JavaScript. You've got the CLR runtime, and then you have your browser. So what's missing on the SPA side is something that handles the data binding. So what we're going to do is use Knockout, which is a JavaScript library that handles data binding. Now, there are a few options you have. There are a few popular libraries. We're going to use Knockout for this particular example today. I'm going to tweet a couple links that'll give you walkthroughs in the library of your choice. So, if Knockout isn't something that you want to use or want to learn, please be patient, and you can definitely follow along and follow the other link that I'm going to be providing you with to learn about some other binding technologies. Now that we're clear on the basic technology stack and we understand how it compares to WPF, let's now look at the bare essentials of a single page application. Let's look at the bare minimum. What are the basic pieces that we need to make a single page application? Well, the first thing we need is something to serve or to hold the HTML and JavaScript that the browser is going to be requesting. So that can be either a web server or it can actually even be the file system. Next, you need some mechanism to interact with the data, right? So this is typically done using Ajax. And now all you need is a browser. That's really it. These are the bare essentials of any single page application. Now you can get more complex. You can start talking about other technologies about what database you're going to use, what you're going to use for modeling your data, etc. You can also go a little bit deeper and talk about if you're going to use REST APIs, but at the end of the day, this is the bare minimum that you need. So now that we understand the bare essentials, let's see how that maps into a real-world context. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the Gmail application and talk about the Gmail application in terms of those bare essentials. So let's see how this thing works. So this is the Gmail application right here. I'm just going to refresh the page. Let's talk about what's happening here. So the first thing that happens is that the HTML and CSS are loaded into the browser. Right? So you have the HTML, CSS, and the JavaScript loaded in. Along with that, the data, the initial data set is loaded into the browser. So basically what's happening is all of the essential data that's needed for your basic interaction is already on the client side, which means that if I wanted to read an email right now, I don't have to wait for a postback. So I don't have to wait for a server to respond, and I'm not blocked while I'm waiting. So let me do this. I'm just going to click something. So I just clicked the first email, and you can see how responsive that was, right? I'm going to go back, and I'll click the second one. So the reason why that's so responsive is because, number one, all the HTML and CSS has already been loaded. Number two, the data has been loaded as well. So the only thing that had to happen for me to accomplish my task and actually read that email, or get the text from that email to display, is that the JavaScript had to manipulate the HTML, and the browser just had to repaint. That's the only thing that had to happen. Right? Pretty basic. So we just saw all the essentials, and we saw how the essentials are pieced together in a real-world context. So now what we're going to do is look at a very basic Hello World spa, and we'll see how to build that. So now we'll learn how to build a spa. So to learn how to build a spa, what we're going to do is we're going to dissect a single page application. We're going to look at a very basic spa. So what I did is I put together the most basic spa that I could think of. What I want to do is come up with the simplest example possible that still demonstrates all the key elements of a single page application. So let's take a look at that now. Here's the application. It's a customers management system, and we'll go to the home page here. So this is the beginning, or the home page. You have customer management system, and what you can do here is view your customers. So you can get a list of all your customers, and you can also drill down and look into the details of a particular customer. So let's click View Customers, and you can see that there is no page refresh necessary, and we have a list of all of our customers. I can then drill in and look at the details of a particular customer. I can go back, select another customer, and I think you get the point. So one of the things that I want to point out here is that we're not going back and requesting more HTML and CSS. So when I open the app originally in the browser, all the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript loaded, along with all the data that I need. From that point onwards, when I click something, the only thing that's happening is that the JavaScript is manipulating the HTML. And without further ado, let's take a look at all the code that makes this possible. So let's take a look at the two main files that make all this magic happen. One is customers HTML, which provides a presentation layer along with the CSS that it pulls in. And the second main file is the customer view model, which is a JavaScript file. So as I mentioned before, we're using the knockout JavaScript library. So that's what we're using for our data binding. We're using the MVVM model, or the model view model. And for those of you who aren't familiar with this architecture, I'm going to give you a brief review. And if you'd like to dig further, please ping me on Twitter, and I'd be happy to point you to any articles that I've written or articles that other folks have written that I feel are very helpful. So let's do a quick run through the basics of the MVVM architecture. So in the model view model, you have number one, the view, which is nothing but your web page, right? It's what your what your end user is going to be interacting with, right? It's a user interface. It's basically the HTML and the CSS. Next, you have the model, which is nothing but your data. And the glue that's in between the view and the model is a view model. The view model is responsible for obtaining the data from the model and exposing it to the view in terms of properties. So what it's going to do is basically interact with the model, hydrate itself with data, and expose that data to the view via properties. And what the view is going to do is basically bind or attach itself to the properties. So let's take a look at this here. Here is our view model. Let me just collapse it for a second. Open it back up. So we have the customer view model. It's a basic class here in JavaScript. And we've got some properties here. Let me point them out. One is a customers array. So this is going to be our array of customer objects. And you'll notice here that the type that we're using is observable array. So this is a knockout type. And what an observable is a type that can be observed, right? Just like it sounds. So what happens with an observable is if you have a property that's of type observable or observable array, right, which is in the same family, anything that observes it, such as an HTML element in the user interface, will be updated automatically when that particular property changes. So we start off with, let's say, having a list in HTML being bound to this properties, right, the customer property. And when you start out with no data, right? So you start out with without having any data hydrated in the customer's property. And if you start out in that state in HTML or on the web page, you won't have any information showing in your list. But then as soon as something happens inside the view model and that property is hydrated or populated with the data, Knockout will ensure that anything that is using the customer's property of the view model will be updated. So Knockout will take care of updating the HTML, and the browser will repaint that area, the specific area of the page that needs that information. So that's how the magic actually happens. So we have our customer's property. We also have this current context property. Now I'm using the current context property for navigational purposes. So let's go back to our sample app now. So let's start with at home. When I click View Customers, what I'm doing behind the scenes is we're updating the current context to a ViewAll state. So when we update the view model to the ViewAll state, what we're doing is we're telling the view that we're in a different state right now. We're in a different view. So what we want to do is display that portion of the HTML elements that pertain to this particular view. Now I'm doing this as an example just to show you how you can use the current context to manipulate different views, and how you can basically switch from one view or one task to another without going to different web pages. Now in production, this isn't the most optimal way of doing it. There are other navigation techniques that are much more optimal. I'm just using this to show you a quick example. Now there are actual JavaScript libraries that are written for this purpose, and they do a wonderful job. Now, that's beyond the scope of this particular webinar, but you should know that they're available. And if you hit me up on Twitter, I'll send you that information. I'll definitely be tweeting that information and posting that to my blog. So now that we understand the properties here, let's move on to some other pieces. First of all, some other properties that I want to point out are customer full name, email address, and picture URL. So you might have noticed that when we drill down, let's go back here. So when we drill into a particular customer, let's go into Christina, just drill down here, you can see that we have her details. So those details are coming from these properties right here: current customer full name, current customer email address, current customer picture URL. And for simplicity's sake, what I'm doing is I'm exploding out the current customer object into these separate fields, just because I want to display how they're bound, how the HTML elements actually consume these properties. Okay, so now that we understand our properties, let's take a look at our methods or operations. So the most important one is load customers. This is where our view model is going to talk to the data service and actually get the customer information. So let's see how that's done. All we're doing here is newing up a data service object. We're calling get customers on it, and then we take the return value, which is an array, we iterate through it, and for each value in that array, we're going to create a customer object and push it into our customers array property, right? So this right here is the observable array that we looked at earlier, right? And this is the property that we're exposing to the view. So as long as there's HTML elements that are bound or basically attached to this particular property, they're going to get updated via knockout as soon as we hydrate that property, which we're doing here. So that's how that magic happens. But now let's see how we go from page to page, so to speak. So let's go back here and start at home. So remember, in a classic web application, these would actually be separate pages. If I clicked View Customers, we'd go to some type of a new page that would basically display all these customers. And if I drill down, we might go to a details page that would show the details of a particular customer. But as you know, in this single page application, that's not the case. We're not going from page to page. This is all happening on the single page. So you might be wondering how that's working. How did the details show up right here? How does that HTML section update? So I'm going to show you how that works. Let's look at the ViewAll function. So the ViewAll function is what basically makes all the customers show up. So when I click View Customers, what's happening behind the scenes is that button click is tied to the ViewAll method. And let's take a look at that. All we're doing here is changing the current context to all, meaning we want to see all the customers. And I'll show you how that works in a minute. Let me just walk through the rest of these. And we have a reset function, which when you click go back home, we basically just reset everything back to the home state. So here all we're doing is changing the context to home, right? So that's basically the home page. Right here is basically the View All Customers page. That's how that works. And then to drill down into a particular customer, right, to get the details, what we're doing is we're switching the current context to the details. And we're taking whatever customer has been clicked, which is going to be in the this object, and we're basically reading that into separate properties. Now remember, we don't have to do this. We could just have one particular property that says current customer, right? And we could have our HTML bound to that. But for simplicity's sake, I want to use separate fields so you can see exactly how each element is bound. I don't want to get into nesting during this webinar. And the final thing that I want to show you is a call to load customers within the constructor itself. So when this object is created, what it's going to do is call its own method load customers. So when the HTML is loaded into the browser and the CSS is loaded, and once we create the view model, at the same time we're going to pull in all the customer information into the client side. So now that we're clear on how the view model works, let's take a look at the HTML itself. Don't worry about taking any notes, and also don't worry if you miss anything in the view model. I'm going to be providing all of the source code to you. So let's go ahead and look at the view again. The next thing that I'm going to explain is how the sections work. So as we all know, this is actually one page, right? This is a single page app. Even though we have three logical pages, right, or three separate task areas. One is the home area, which is this. Second is the area where we can view all of the customers. And the third is a detailed area, right? So with a classic web application, these should actually be 3 pages. And then that would take you to a customer view page. And then once you drill down into it, you'd go to, let's say, a customer's detail page. But we all know that this isn't the case. So I want to show you how this works. So let's take a look at the HTML code. The first thing that I want to do is just show you the basics of this. So this is a very basic page here. Let's start with line 1. First thing that we're doing here is just identifying the particular document type. We don't want our browser to have to guess. We want to be as explicit as possible. So we're just telling it what type it is. Then you have the body. I'm not going to go into specifics of styling or the CSS because that really doesn't have anything to do with the functionality, so I'm not going to bother with it in this webinar. You have a header over here, right? You have some HTML to give you a little menu. Let me collapse that. But what's most important is these 3 sections right here. So these 3 sections are the most important thing to understand. And this is how we actually go from task area to task area. So let's start with the home area, right? I don't want to call it a page, just call it an area. So let's take a look at what we're looking at here in terms of HTML. And now we'll switch back to the home area. So if you look at this particular area, think about the HTML elements. They're all contained in this section. That's all it is. Now, this is the most important line of this section. What we're doing here is we're data binding to the view model. And we're data binding to the view model. And what we're doing is we're setting the property to this whole div. We're setting the visible property. And we're setting it based on the current context. So we're saying this is only visible, right? Only show this home section if the current context is home. And if you remember, let's switch back to the view model. If you remember, the default that we set this property to is home. So that's why when you first load the page, you see this. Right? You first load the page and you see the home area because the current context is set to home, and this div is set to be visible if the current context is set to home. Right? Very straightforward, very basic. Let's go to the next section. As you would imagine, the next section works the same way. So let's click View Customers and take a look at this section here. And now let's look at it in HTML. So this is the same section that shows you all the customers. So what are we doing here? As we did with the home section, we are setting it visible if the current context is all, as in view all customers. And over here, we have a list, and we're data binding using for each. So what we're doing is we're data binding to the customers property of the view model. And for each of the customers, what we're doing is we're repeating this. So this is a template that's going to repeat for each customer in the array. So for each customer in the array, we're going to add this div. So we're going to put an image, and we're going to bind the image to the picture URL of that particular object. We're also going to display some text below, which is going to be bound to the full name property of that particular customer object as we're iterating through. And finally, let's look at that detail section here to see how that shows up. Let's go ahead and switch back. I'm going to click in. Let's go ahead and click Ted. And you can see here that we have Ted's name and his email address. And if we switch back to the HTML, let's look at the customer details section here. And you can see it's the same idea. We have an image. That image is bound to the current customer picture URL. So that's how we're able to render Ted's picture. And then we have some text below that with his full name and his full email address. Right? Very straightforward. So now you can clearly see how all of the information is displayed in each section, right? We can clearly see how each particular task area is laid out. So now let's look at how we bound the buttons. So when I click View Customers, how does that work? How does this work right here? So let's take a look at those buttons and see the magic behind those. So here's our first button, View Customers, and it's very straightforward. What we're doing is we're binding the click event for that particular button to the ViewAll method in the view model. So let's look at that. So basically you click View Customers, that click event is connected to ViewAll, so ViewAll gets invoked, and let's look at ViewAll. ViewAll sets the current context to all. If we go back here, we know that once the current context is set to all, the ViewAll section will immediately become visible. And because everything else is based on current context, all the other sections will become invisible. Right? So that's how the click works, and we basically did the same thing with all of the buttons. So for every button, you're going to see it being data bound to a click event, and you're going to see the corresponding method being used. And let's go ahead and debug this just so you can actually visually see it happening. So first thing that I want to point out is that I'm using Notepad++ for editing here, and we're going to be using the built-in debugger for Internet Explorer. So let's jump in here. To invoke the debugger, press F12, and now we can take a look at all the script that's being run. So we're going to click this area right here that shows all the scripts that are loaded, and we're going to click Customer View Model, and we can go ahead and set a breakpoint. So let's do this. Here's the ViewAll method. Let's go ahead and add a breakpoint here. We could just F9 it there, and we'll go ahead and start debugging. So let me click Start Debugging, and we'll switch back. So let's click View Customers to invoke that method. And you can see here that clicking that button clearly invoked this method. let's go ahead and F10, and let's just F5 and go past that. Okay. Okay, this is all pretty straightforward here. Let's stop debugging. And let's go back and look at our code. So now we can clearly see how all of the task areas are set up and bound, right? We can clearly see how they're being rendered, how different areas are being set visible and invisible, right, based on the context. We also saw how the buttons are being bound to methods. But one of the questions you might ask is, how does this page know, how does this code know that when we say current context, right, we're talking about a property on that view model? How does it know that? Where's the connection? So that's a question you might ask yourself. Let's take a look at some other things here. For instance, for each. When we're using data binding here, we're saying for each and we're saying customers. How does it know that customers refers to that view model? So now let's take a step back and explain that. Let me collapse these. So let's open up the head section. So here we just have some script that we're pulling in. So we're using jQuery, using knockout, and you saw we have a customer view model. We also have a customer class, and this is the data service that we were using. Some CSS, but what's really important here is the script and document ready. So this is where we make that connection between the view and the view model. What we're doing here is we're instantiating that customer view model, which code that we just looked at. Right? So we're basically newing it up, and we're calling the knockout apply bindings method and passing in the view model. So what we're doing is we're telling knockout, hey, when we say bind, anytime we use data bind, this is the view model that we're referring to. So that's how that connection is made. And with that, we basically end the walkthrough of building that app. So let's summarize how to build this basic application. All you need to do is to have a view model here that's basically going to be in charge of interacting with your data service or the data layer, hydrating itself full of the data. Then you have an HTML page that binds to that data and also binds to the behaviors. You reference the knockout library, and you associate that view with the view model. In a nutshell, that's all you need. So what I'd encourage you to do is to download the source code that I'm going to provide you with, step through it, start modifying it, just play around with it and start learning how to change different things, and you'll really get a feel of how this works. Once you get the basics down, you'll be able to move into more advanced applications. So now that we have a clear understanding of how a basic single-page application works, let's take this a step further and figure out how to put together a single-page application with some real server-side components. So in the simple example that we've seen thus far, we simply pulled our data from the local file system, right? And we know that in production, in a real line of business application, that wouldn't be the case. We'd have to communicate with some server. So what we're going to do now is use Microsoft's Web API to build us a solid server-side infrastructure that we can use from our single-page application to read and write data to. So what we're going to do is use the same application, right, our customer management system,
and we're just going to slowly start tweaking it to use the web API to get its information as far as customers are concerned instead of the local file system, right? So we're going to slowly make the transition into the next layer of complexity. So to do that, we're going to open Visual Studio and create a web API project. So up until this point, we haven't used Visual Studio. We've basically been using Notepad++, or basically just any text editor, to create our single page application. So now that we're going to start using server-side technology, we're going to open Visual Studio up. Let's go ahead and open up Visual Studio. And I'm using 2012, but you don't need to. We're going to be using an MVC4 project. So let's start by doing File, New, selecting New Project, and what we're going to do is use the ASP MVC4 web application template. So we're going to use that project, and let's just call it Customer Management. I'll click OK, and we'll go ahead and use the web API. What's really nice about this is that you can create a unit test if you'd like to. In this case, we're just trying to do a quick sample, so we're not going to use a unit test. I clicked OK, and let's let Visual Studio generate our project for us. So for those of you who are familiar with MVC, let's just quickly do a walkthrough. For those of you who aren't familiar with MVC, this will be a quick crash course. I'm going to close the default window that's open here, and we'll focus on the right hand side. So let's go look at the Solutions Explorer and see what we've got. So in MVC, you have the models, which is basically your data, right? And then you have the views, which is basically what your end user is going to interact with, right? Just like MVVM, or very similar to MVVM. Then you have your controllers. And your controllers are basically the go-betweens between the model and the views. In MVC, the controllers are your entry points. So let's see what we get out of the box. First of all, we got the home controller. And of course, for those of you who are familiar with MVC, you can see that the home controller is derived from controller. Right? Pretty standard. It's just going to return the view. Let's just quickly, I'll put a breakpoint here, and we'll quickly debug this. I'll hit F5, just watch what's going to happen. So we have the home controller, and then we have a home view. So I'm going to navigate down to the home view to show you that. And what's basically going to happen is our entry point is going to be the home controller by default. When I hit F5, the home controller will be invoked. And you just saw the browser come up. Let me just make this text a little bit bigger. The home controller is invoked, and you can see that it's just basically going to return the home view. So let's watch it. And we see that the home view is returned. So we're at our browser and we're looking at the home view. So this isn't really web API. This is just basically MVC, more or less. We're looking at the view. So in web API, of course, you don't really have a user interface, right? This is all a server-side, back-end or middle-tier technology, so to speak. And our web page, or a single-page app, is basically going to be using this to get the customer information. But by default, you get this little home page. We're going to close this, and now we're going to dig a little bit deeper into the web API and see what you can actually use to get your data. So other than the home controller, another controller that you have is the values controller. So this is actually more significant than the home controller. Let's look at the values controller. So what you get here is an entry point into your values controller, and basically from the browser or from the caller, you have verbs that are mapped to specific methods. So your default get is basically going to invoke this method, and it'll return all of the values. So in Web API, what we're doing is we're using something called convention over configuration. So basically, by convention, by our naming convention, we're going to configure what happens. So we have values, right? This could be customers, but in this case, it's just values, which is going to be our, the type of data that we're going to be managing here. So since we have values controller. If we had customers, we'd have a customers controller. And when a get is called for this particular method is going to be invoked, and we're going to return all of the values, right? Just like all the customers, we're going to return all the values, value 1, value 2. Now I'm not going to focus on the put, delete, and post right now. I'm just going to focus on get to get us started. If you wanted to do a get and pull something specific, for instance, a value or a particular customer by ID, what you would do is you'd use this convention here, and you'd say get the values, and you'd put in an integer into the get string, so to speak, and it would map into this method right here just by convention. And basically what you would do in production is write some logic to retrieve the particular value with the ID that was passed in. Very straightforward. So let's go ahead and debug this and see how this works. So I'm going to put a breakpoint in the default get. We're going to go ahead and run this. I'm going to hit continue for a second, because what I'm going to do is invoke this with Chrome instead of Internet Explorer. The reason why is I want to view the results in XML. I think Chrome makes it a little bit easier here. So I'm going to go ahead and type in, I just cut and paste basically that same URL, and you can see here, as soon as I did that, the home controller got invoked. I'll just tap continue, and you can see that's just the home controller, right? We're not interested in the home controller, so I'm going to remove this breakpoint here, and we're talking about the values controller. And you'll notice one difference here. It's derived from API controller. So that's the biggest difference between home, which is returning a view, and values controller, which is returning some data and not an HTML page. So let's do this again. Let's open up Chrome, and let's try to move a window here, get everything set up a little bit better. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is use the same convention that I mentioned, API. So by default, all web API controllers start with the prefix API, and you can change this in a file over here, Visual Studio, but we're going to keep it the same for now. So I'm going to type in values, right? If you want to invoke the values controller, you type in values. Remember, here we go. Remember, we're using convention versus configuration. So I just typed in values. I didn't specify an ID, and lo and behold, you can see what got invoked. The default get method. And let's go ahead and continue. We could F5 it, and let's make this text a little bit bigger. So you can see what was returned here, value 1 and 2. Right? So if we want to get a specific ID instead, just put in an ID. I'm going to type in 1, hit enter, and you can see now we get a specific value, right, which is here. Now, of course, in production, in real code, we'd do some logic to retrieve the particular value. Let me move the breakpoint. I'll just show that to you again. Let's invoke it again, and there you go. You can see we're in the debugger here. The right method got invoked. Why? Because we're specifying an ID. That's all we need to do. and we're going to go ahead and return that value. That's all there is to it. So in a nutshell, that's how Web API works, and that's how easy it is just to get up and running and to start using it. So what we're going to do now is take this a step further, and we'll actually create a Web API project that's going to return us our customers, right? So just like we got the customers from our data service before, and we went to the file system, we're now going to add the server component to our basic app to step it up a notch. So let's see, what's the first thing that we need? The first thing that we need to do is add that model. We need to add that same structure that we had right on the server side. So let's go ahead and create a new model class. So I'm just going to go ahead and add a new class, and we'll call this customer. Here we go. And let's go ahead and just give this some fields. Right? We'll do the same thing that we did in the SPA, right? Same thing that we did in JavaScript. We could actually cut and paste the code and massage it a little bit, but let's just go ahead and write that out. So we'll do ID first, make it an int, and let's make a getter and setter. Okay. Now let's go ahead and do just the basic information that we need. We can make it fancy later. Okay, first name. See, the rest are probably going to be strings here. So we've got first name, last name, email address. What else do we need? We need company and picture URL. Okay, great. So we should be fine here. Let's make sure we didn't make any typos. Let's just do a quick build. Okay, good. The build succeeded. Let me just make this font a little bit bigger for everyone to see. Okay. So now we have our model, right? You know me, I always like to start with the back end. I always start with the model, then I move my way up. So now that we have our model defined, let's go ahead and create a controller. So remember, the controller is going to be the entry point for customers. So we have a values controller. We saw how that worked. Now we need a customers controller. So I'm just going to do this by hand. There's other ways of doing this. And they'll save you a lot of time. For now, I'm just going to go ahead and do one by hand. So I'm going to go ahead and add controller. And we'll call this customers controller. And if you noticed, it already put in that convention that I was talking about, right? So we had values controller, now we have customers controller. And we're going to start with an empty API controller. Okay. Now we could have used some other tricks to get us started by having some code generated for us. But what I want to do is just take it slowly, and we'll show everyone what the minimum you need to do is just to get started. Later on we can get fancy and start using some of the productivity tools. But I always think it's better to start with the basics. So let's get some room here and start writing some code here. So just like the values controller, let's start with the values controller again. So if you look at the values controller, what you need is some code to do the basic gets and get with an ID. So we're going to go back to customer controller and we'll write the same code. So let's do this. Make it a public method. and we'll return an IEnumerable of type customer. Let me see. It's not finding that. I think I have to add using to our models. There we go. Okay, now it should show up. There we go, customer. And let's do get all customers. Okay. And we're just going to go ahead and say return customers, but we need some customers to return, so let's just do this for now. Comment this out. Okay, now what we need to do is create some customers to return. So of course what we do in production, in a real line of business application is, work with the entity framework, work with SQL Server, basically call some real data store to procure that data that we need to push back, right? The customers, the customer business objects. In this case, what we're going to do is just hard code some examples right here. Just hard code the data. So let me go and grab a snippet. And it's basically a cut and paste from JavaScript. So I'm just going to take this and let's switch back here and make the text a little bit bigger here. I'll maximize it so you can read a little bit better. And go ahead and paste this in. And now I can uncomment that. Let's see. I should have used some better naming convention. It's okay. So basically, here's what we're doing. Right, we're referencing that model. So we're saying creating a new array of customers, and this is the array right here. Right, the exact same thing we had in JavaScript, literally. Just had to change a few things here and there. And that's our member variable. So get all customers is just going to return that array of customers. And let's make one more method. Let's make a method to return a specific customer. So we'll do public customer instead of an IEnum. Get customer by ID, let's say. And it'll take an int of an ID. And let's see, let's create a variable to return this information. Let's see here. So basically what we're just saying is, hey, give us the first customer that matches the ID that was passed in. That's all we're doing. And let's see, so we should have read them into this variable now, so let's just return this variable. Right? That's all we should need to do to get this thing working. Let's make the text a little bit big. And again, don't worry if you can't read this text, because I'm going to be posting the link that has all this code for you. So you'll be able to step through it, read it a lot better. There, so we basically have the same thing that we looked at in values. We have get customers, right, like get values. And remember, I can say get all, I can say basically whatever I want. The main thing is that this get is going to map to the default, no default parameterless get which is going to give us all the customers. And then the get customer ID is going to map to the particular ask that includes an ID. And it's just going to go to that customers, and it's going to grab us the first customer that matches that ID and return it back. So let's go ahead and make sure this compiles. Good. Our build succeeded. Let's go ahead and run this guy, and we'll test him out. So again, we're starting up in Internet Explorer, but I'm going to use, I'm going to be using Chrome because I want to see all of the data in XML. So let's go ahead and do this. So instead of values, I'm going to say customers. And there you go. We have all of our customers. And this guy here on the right was invoked. Now let's say, let me use a breakpoint here. Let's say get customer by ID. So here we go back to our left in Chrome, and I'm going to pass in an ID. Let me just pass in 1, and let's see who that should give us. So 1 should give us Jenny Gibson. Let's try that. So we have 1 here, and I'm going to go ahead and hit the enter key, and you can see this invoked exact method we're trying to evoke. Let's go ahead and F5 this, and you can see, sure enough, we returned Jenny Gibson. So this is exactly what we wanted. So now that we have our web API working, and we demonstrate that by just using a browser, let's go ahead and change our application to use web API instead of the file system to get its data. So let's go ahead and go back to our sample basic application. We'll go make the tweaks that we need to do. So I'm going to open up Notepad++. And remember the basic HTML page, with our sections. This is all the same code. What we're going to do now is go to, and we're not going to touch the HTML. We're not going to touch the view at all. We don't need to. The view is all set. Remember, we've separated everything very nicely in a very clean MVVM way. So now we're going to go to the customer view model. And if you'll remember, to get customer data, we made this load customers function. And we basically called our data service, which is basically just getting all of that information from the file system, returning us a JSON array. We're iterating through it and pushing it into our customers array. So what we're going to do is just rename this to old to make sure we're not using it. We can delete it later on. And we'll create a new load customers method. So I'm going to go back to my snippets. And let's go ahead and grab the new method. And let's go ahead and paste it in. Okay, so now we have this new load method. So let's see what it does. It's using jQuery. It's making an AJAX call, and what it's doing is it's using the same URL that we had in the browser. So you just cut and paste that right from the browser after you test it. It's literally this URL right here. Okay, so I have this URL pasted in here, and we're just going to do a basic get, and we're just going to load all of our customers that we get from the web API and push it right into our array. Very simple. So that's the simple swap out. Let's save this and run it, see if it works. So I'm going to go ahead and click View Customers, and sure enough, we have our customers from the web API. So how do we know this is really going to the web API? Let's debug. I'm going to put a breakpoint over here, customers. Let me move the Solutions Explorer so you can see clearly. So I'm going to hit F5 on the left. So it's really interesting here because we have two things going on. We have the client on the left, which really has nothing to do with the Visual Studio project whatsoever. Right? We're just opening it up from Notepad, and it's being run right off of my file system. So I'm going to hit F5 on the Internet Explorer, and you can see that load customers was invoked, and sure enough, it hit the entry point that we were targeting. Get customers. And let's, you know what? Let's do this. Let's debug this on the client side and the server side. So I'm going to hit F12 here to invoke the debugger. So now we have the debugger in Internet Explorer, and let's go over here. And I just went to the Scripts tab. I'll click Start Debugging, and let this continue so we can get into the spot that we're looking for. Let's open up. Let's put a breakpoint right here where we're newing up the view model. We'll go into the view model here, and we'll put a breakpoint on load customers. Okay, so I'll go back and hit F5. And you can see the first thing that happened was we newed up the view model, and load customers is called when the view model is viewed up. You can see as soon as we stepped over that, so the AJAX call was made. You can say this is happening asynchronously. You can see on the left, I have my control on the client side, but on the right, we're going to go ahead and return those customers. So let's hit continue on the right, and we go back here. So we're back in the client, and we're going to go ahead and step over and just let it run. And here we have our customers. So that's all there is to it. Now, of course, we can start getting more fancy, more intricate, more complex, and adding some write methods, but this is as far as we're going to go for this webinar.
So what we're going to do before we summarize and look at next steps is we're going to look at an application that I wrote that takes us to the next level. What I want to do is come up with something that shows you how you can really improve the user experience of a basic application. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a very basic application here, such as SharePoint, something that everyone's familiar with, and I'll show you how you can use some of the skills that you just learned to really improve the user experience to a few levels of magnitude. So let's look at this. So here's just a standard SharePoint site that I think we're all familiar with. Here you have your lists, you have the picture library, some tasks, etc. So let's take a look at this application that we have here. So I wrote this single page application, and I used some of the Infragistics tools to really show you how you can make the most out of this type of architecture. So what you're looking at on the left is SharePoint 2010. What you're looking at on the right is a client that I've written for SharePoint, and it's going to be accessing the exact same SharePoint server. And the only difference is I'm not going to be using postbacks. I'm using the single page application model to really improve the user experience. So let's look to the left. And let's say I wanted to browse to the asset picture library. I'm going to click it, and when I click asset picture library, if you look at the bottom, you can see that we're going to load an all items ASPX page. So we're actually going to go and pull up another web page and talk to the server. And we're going to wait while that's being done. So I'm going to click it now. And there you go, we're waiting, and this is what we get. So let's take a look. Let's compare apples to apples. I'm going to go into our application that we've written here. And let's just toggle through, swipe from side to side. So you can see the difference in user experience, right? At the end of the day, which experience would you rather provide to your users? Now let's go look at a different view. Let's look at shared documents here, or let's drill down into financial and legal documents. So every time I drill down, there's a post back, right? So I drill down, there's more, synchronous communication. Let's do it on the right side. See the difference. So let's find financial and legal docs. And when I drill down, I want you to look very carefully. You'll see that there's no post backs. Right, so all this is happening very quickly. All we're doing is making some asynchronous calls, getting the data, and just updating the HTML. So let's take a look at tasks. We're going to go tasks in the standard format, or tasks the SPA way. So remember, we're accessing the exact same SharePoint site, and just see the difference here. I can clearly and very easily scroll across. I can just move across from page to page and check out all my tasks without a single post back. You can see how quick that is. And if I wanted to filter, very easy. Let's look for something with 239 in. There you go, right? No post back, all very quick. So I'm using the Infragistics grid here, and we actually give this grid away for free. This is part of our Ignite UI framework. This is our HTML5 tool set. So if you'd like to get up and running with this grid, you can go to infragistics.com, and you can download the trial, or actually just download this for free, and you could use this in production free of charge. Let's take a look at some visualization. So let's say I just wanted to visualize all of my tasks and kind of see how they're broken down. I'm going to click on this chart here on the right hand side, and now we can get a nice breakdown, see how they're assigned to. Let's take a look at another breakdown, and if you watch very carefully, you'll see that there's no post back. I'm just going to click this chart again, and you can see we have a breakdown on priority. I'll click it again, change the breakdown to status. And if you notice, there's no post backs. Very snappy. You can see I can just move from view to view, and it's very responsive. I don't have to wait for post backs. There's no flickering. It's very smooth. So tomorrow, what we're going to do is have another webinar where we dig a little deeper, and we'll show you how to make something of this nature. What we're going to do is show you how to make a line of business application versus just a hello world application. So please tune in tomorrow. The webinar is going to be at the same time. But now let's go ahead and summarize and look at next steps. And I'll also share my contact information again. So let's go ahead and summarize what we looked at today and talk about next steps. So the first thing that we did is we looked at why spas are getting so much attention today. Right? We looked at the evolution of enterprise application history, so to speak, and we saw how single-page applications basically blend the best of both worlds, or both paradigms. You have the responsiveness of a native executable running on the client side, but at the same time you have the ease of deployment. We looked at the anatomy of a single-page application. We looked at the HTML, CSS, all the basic pieces. We looked at how you can actually build a very basic, simple, single-page application. And to take it to the next step, I'd like to invite everyone to the webinar that we're doing tomorrow, which is on building an HTML5 JavaScript line of business application. So we're basically going to be picking up right where we left off today. And again, please feel free to contact me with any questions via Twitter. If you follow me at AnandRaja777 and ping me with a question, I will be sure to answer you. Now, I might not get back to you within a few hours or a day, but I do promise that I will get back to you. And if we don't answer all of your questions in the question box, again, please go ahead and feel free to ping me. I'll definitely get back to you. I'll also be posting all the answers to the Q&A box on my blog, and I'll be tweeting that link to the blog as well. So I hope everyone enjoyed the webinar, and please feel free to start submitting your questions to the box now.